For more than 2 decades, Dick Pound has been one of the most influential members of the International Olympic Committee. He's been one of the world's most influential advocates against doping in sports. We sat down with the former vice president of the IOC here in Toronto. We began by asking him why he began his crusade against doping.
I had sort of thought that all these statements by sports federations and others that they had a good anti-doping program were all true. Turned out they were all false. They had no doping programs, and all they were doing was saying what they thought would be receptive in the public. So then you realize you're in a fight. At that point, okay, the gloves come off and you fight.
And the gloves are still off. Take me into how widespread you think doping is now, and I mean demographically. How young are kids in the sporting world getting into serious doping programs?
Well, the data are not really available because it's all clandestine. That's the problem. So, you know, when you talk about young kids being in doping programs, I mean, there may be some state or club or sport organized things, but a lot of them are just taking it on their own, which is kind of scary because they have no idea what it is or where it came from. At the far end, at the over 40s, where you know, maybe they're out there with the Sudafed and so on, but you know, I'm not too worried about that. I'm really worried about the credibility of sport at the national and international level.
Where does the blame belong if you're looking at the national, international level? Is it the athlete? There's no shortage of scapegoats out there, whether it's Marion Jones, Ben Johnson, A-Rod, etc., the big names, Lance Armstrong, obviously. Do they deserve all the blame? Should it be spread around?
Well, I think the athlete at a certain point has to share the blame. I think there are a lot of pushers that encourage you to do it. Coaches, team officials, you name it. They're all there saying, yes, try this, do that. If you want to be in my program, I can remember when in the 1960s when I went down to a swimming meet at Yale. One of the guys where I was staying in his room had a younger brother who was finishing high school, and his college coach said, if you don't come back here 25 pounds heavier this fall, forget it. I mean, that's a lot of stake. And I think the suggestion was that there are other ways you can gain the weight, but gain it and come back, otherwise you're not in our program.
What percentage of Olympic level swimmers do you think now are doping at some stage of the training process to get to the Olympics?
An exact number, very hard to say. A considerable number. My guess would be double digits, but because the data are not there, it's hard to say it's 17.4.
What about track and field athletes?
I think there's probably an even bigger problem in track and field than there is in swimming. There's a study that has kind of been held back at the moment because of the methodology being somewhat suspect, which suggests that it's up 39 or 40% of all athletes doing it, on a double-blind test where you don't have to disclose whether you're answering the test or not. That's pretty scary.
What about weightlifting? And that's one of those sports that historically people looked at it, and you're going all the way back to the 50s and 60s and said doping is part of it. It
was pretty endemic in weightlifting. I mean, it was up there at the level of cycling, maybe even more. I mean, when I was in 1960, there were no rules at that point. There was no anti-doping code. There was no nothing. Everybody knew that the weightlifters were doing it. Everyone knew that the field of the shot, discus, hammer guys are doing. They're all out there saying, oh, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm doing Diana ball." "Oh, that's good. And how much are you taking?" And they'd share all the information. What happens when there's a rule that says it's prohibited is it all goes underground, and then the discussion stops. But the shapes of shot putters and so on change from the big beery guys to folks that were pretty buff, and the throws were going from 60 feet to 70 feet in a very short period of time. That was not mom's oatmeal porridge.
In your book in 2006, Inside Dope, you said this about the NHL, that there's no hope for hockey until its leaders and players recognize that there is a problem. 7 years later, has hockey recognized that problem?
Well, you still have the commissioner out there saying things like, there's nothing on the WADA list that would help a hockey player. Therefore, hockey players don't take any of them. Therefore, there's no need to test them. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. So have they recognized it? No. When we got the World Anti-Doping Code together, we said, listen, here's a tool that might be of interest to the major leagues, the professional leagues, if they really mean what they say. And to a league, they all said, don't bother us. We don't have a doping problem in name the sport. And even though we don't have one, we have the gold medal testing program, and so go get your own house in order and don't bother us.
What about Major League Baseball? And I want to reference an article in the New York Times this past weekend, and it asked whether Miguel Cabrera is the, quote, hero of the post-steroid era. Do you think there is a post-steroid era in Major League Baseball that we're seeing right now?
I don't think so, not yet. I mean, that's the way you try and solve an endemic crisis in a sport in kind of a corporate way. You fire the CEO, declare the problem solved, and it's the golden road is ahead of you. But have baseball players stopped using steroids or HGH or whatever else they're using? Of course not.
The WADA test in 2012 for all of baseball, only 1.3% tested positive. What do you think of a number like that?
Well, I think our science is good, and I know the lab that baseball is using, it's one of the best in the world. So either people know they're going to be tested or they're testing at the wrong time.
Is there a big money sport or high profile sport that you think can be considered clean?
I think they're all at risk. Every single sport with different stuff for different purposes, but there's no sport, there's no country, there's no player that's not at risk.
Is there a professional sport that you would consider the worst offender, where you would look at it and say, at this level, what we're watching is a competition of doping efficacy rather than athletic talent?
Well, let me put it this way without answering your question directly. I don't bother watching the Tour de France anymore. I mean, I think the question is you go after and say, how is it, knowing what you know about your sport, knowing your riders, knowing what they're doing, you've all been involved in this sport for years, you're at the highest levels, how is it possible that somebody like Lance Armstrong was out there for 9 years and you never caught him? How is that possible? And when they come up with an answer to that...
Do you have an answer for that?
Well, I think in his case, my view is that he was their poster boy and they didn't want to catch him. I mean, cycling had been drifting down and down and down, and then you had Lance's story, cancer survivor, and then all of a sudden he's out there winning cycling races, and all of a sudden he's winning the Tour de France. What a story. And he wins it not once, not twice. It was incredible in the legal sense, not wide world of sport sense.
Tell me about soccer and FIFA. Do they fall in the same boat? And I'm again referencing the testing results from 2012. 30,000 international soccer players tested, 0.6% of athletes testing positive. Does FIFA play a role in that?
Well, I think if you examine the number of tests done by FIFA, I think we're 500 in the world's biggest sport, by the world's strongest governing body, 500 tests. The FIFA president has been in denial about doping in football since we started. Almost, a la Bettman. Nothing would help a footballer, therefore they don't take it. Therefore we don't have to test. So you'd have to really be able to do a forensic analysis of who was tested, when, under what circumstances, and perhaps more importantly, who was not tested.
How effective is scapegoating? And again, going back to the big names, the Ben Johnson, Marion Jones, the list goes on, Lance Armstrong. How do you incentivize a sports governing body, a nation, to catch, name, and shame the biggest stars in the sport, and sometimes the biggest stars in that particular country? How do you incentivize at that level? Well,
I think you've got to get people to understand that if you don't solve this, it's a form of corruption in the sport. It's just as bad as illegal betting. That if the credibility disappears from the sport, people aren't going to do it. People aren't going to support it.
But that hasn't been the case with cycling, for example.
Well, it has. I mean, the only thing that has caught cycling's attention is the fact that team sponsors are dropping off. These people are most sensitive in their wallets.
What is the solution then? From all that you've seen, all the work that's been done, the sports that you've covered, the analysis, is there a solution, something that is a viable solution?
Well, I think it's a combination of values-based plus science-based. You win this, you got to win the hearts and minds here, and that's tough for somebody who's already in the system and been using things. But if you get the ones that are coming in now and say, look, don't do this, but there you've got to get it parents, you've got to get it coaches, you've got to get it everyone saying, do you know who's coaching your kid? I used to say when I was starting off as water president, trying to get people to understand the problem, I don't want, for example, I don't want my child to have to become a chemical stockpile in order to be good at sport, because there are a bunch of sociopaths out there that don't care about the rules. Is that what you want? Who's coaching your kid? And then you need the science. You need to have a good way of detecting. Intelligent testing is far more important to me than doing thousands and thousands of tests. I mean, you think like a doper. You know enough about the sport system. All right, you want to run 9.5 in the 100 meters in Rio, which will be on July 17th. What are you going to have to take to do that? When are you going to take it? And who's most likely to be doing it? And then focus in on, half a dozen or a dozen athletes, and you'll catch them. There is a deterrent of impact on this, and that's also what you look for. So, challenge the use of the word scapegoat. These folks aren't scapegoats. They're people who got caught. They're not the only ones out there doing it.
What can a small organizing body do, or a young sport, like CrossFit, for example? It's just becoming a widely followed and widely practiced sport. What can an small organizing body do to get ahead of the curve? Can it be preempted? Can it be before it even infects a young sport, whether it's CrossFit or any other sport? Can it be taken care of in its infancy?
Well, I think if that's part of the self-image of the sport, yes. Say, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we stand for, and we don't do this.
Dick, thanks very much for the time.
Pleasure.